All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Dibble Institute's October 2017 webinar called The Talk, How Adults Can Promote Young People's Healthy Relationships and Prevent Misogyny and Sexual Harassment. And I'm really thrilled to have Joe McIntyre with us from Harvard University. Hi, Joe.
Hey, everybody.
And I also want to recognize Kathy Guidry's on the line. She's our engineer. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, good afternoon. Glad to be here.
So before we get rolling, I just wanted to say a couple things. First of all, our hearts go out to all the victims of recent disasters around the country. I was starting to list them, too many and too sad. Houston, Florida, Puerto Rico, mountains, the Intermountain West here, fires there, and also today in California. So we hold those people in our hearts and prayers. And if you've been impacted by one of those disasters and it's caused you to lose your Dibble materials, please let us know, and we'd be happy to work with you to get to get your
Muted.
you new materials. So before we move on, let me just ask you to raise your hands, please. How many of this is your first Dibble webinar? You'd raise there's a little box there. Oh, many of you have found that. Okay. All righty. Well, not too many. Well, maybe more than I think. Well, great. Well, welcome to all the newbies, and welcome back to those of you, our friends and colleagues who've been with us before. Let me ask you another question. I'm going to put down all your hands and ask you another question. How many of you how many of you actually do teach relationship skills at your agency or in your program? Or how many of you consider yourselves to be in the field of romantic relationship education? So I could see a poll here so we get a sense of who's in the room. Great. Almost 50-50. It looks like 45% are in the field of relationship education or teach those programs. Well, that's great. And for those of you who aren't, we hope to pique your interest today with Joe's topic. Because I think what's going to be really interesting about this webinar and of great interest to those of you who are either in the field or want to get in the field, is it's going to provide you with great data to make the case for relationship education with partners or settings or sites or even your own management. So I think stay tuned, take notes about information you may want to share with those people about why this field is so important. So Kathy, the next slide, let's just do a little bit of housekeeping. If you, for whatever reason, can't get the audio through your computer, please use this access code, phone number and access code, and you also have it in the email that you were sent with your invitation. We will be welcoming your questions, and we do have a question box or a question you can answer. Or questions you can ask, and we will attempt to answer all questions by the end of this. And if we don't answer them, we will respond after the webinar. We're going to have some poll questions along the way, and those are always fun to look at. And I've already tested you with your raising the hands. In 2 or 3 business days, typically by the end of the week, we will have uploaded this webinar into our archives and sent you a link, because it may be something you want to pass on to management or others in your staff or potential prospects or sites where you want to do relationship education. So the next slide, let's talk a little bit about Dibble, since many of you are unfamiliar. These are 2 of my favorite people. This is Charlie and Helen Dibble. Charlie founded the Dibble Institute when he saw that too many of his young friends were getting derailed because of their love lives. And he started to look for the science behind that. This was in the mid to late 80s, and there started to be science around what made relationships strong and long-lasting and healthy. But when he asked the researchers of the day what they were doing to bring that to young people, they would like shrug their shoulders and say, you know, that's really hard. So he brought 8 of us around his dining room table. This is now the early 90s, and said, I have a dream. I have a dream that this kind of romantic relationship education is available widely. And he's the one who got us started on taking research and translating that into teaching tools that then we make widely available to others, as many on this this webinar know, and through you. So Kathy, the next slide. Thanks to you and others who use our materials, the Dibble Institute has reached, and at this point, it's a very conservative estimate, 1.5 million people, young people, in the last 10 years with a relationship skills program. And the reason I say that's conservative is we only count the first year that we sell a binder. We know some teachers do this. I know teachers up in Idaho and Washington State who've been using relationship skills materials for over a decade. So to them and to all of you who do this good work, we give you a lot of thanks and gratitude. So just quickly on our core values at the Dibble Institute, because people wonder what we stand for. Well, our first and most critical part is we believe in research. We base our materials on research. As the research changes, we adapt our materials because we want to stay true to that. We are non-political. We're not affiliated with any other institution. We're a national independent nonprofit, and we have the luxury of following and really the necessity based on Charlie's guidance of following where the research leads. Secondly, we believe in strong and stable and healthy families, for sure. We recognize, as have many in the field of social science, that children, when possible, are best raised by their own 2 biological parents. But we also realize that sometimes that's not possible. There are scads. I was going to look for a more technical term. There are many, many, countless single parents who every day do the hard work of putting one foot in front of the other and doing the best by their kids. And they are totally amazing. But we also understand from research on them that they often, it's hard. It's really hard raising young people, raising children by yourself. It's hard physically, it's hard financially, it's hard emotionally, it's just hard. And often they would even say that if they had a different choice to make, they would have made, they might have made a different choice. So that's the first thing. Secondly, we also, as we said, believe in healthy families. So if there's a relationship that is marred by abuse, whether of self or others, of substances, or if there's violence, these are not to be tolerated. And so we aren't saying families should stay together at all costs, because there are certainly important times when there's high conflict where it's important for children to be taken out of that. But far too often, families split up over low conflicts, things that could be put together, could be made better. And in those relationships, children really suffer when their parents, you can see the decline in their outputs in their lives as a result of that. So we're here to try to bolster and equip people early on with the skills they need to build healthy romantic lives and strong families. And finally, we believe that all people deserve respect. And so we have intentionally written Dibble materials to not assume the gender of your partner. We believe, you can't tell if you're in a public school setting who's in the room. And of course, no one wants to belittle or have a young person feel alone or different or scared. And everyone needs relationship skills. So we intentionally write our materials to be very inclusive, both culturally inclusive and in terms of sexual orientation. We have specific scenarios specifically for gay and lesbian couples because they do have some different issues that can be used if the instructor wants. So we just want to put it out there that this is not based on heterogeneity. So finally, let's get Joe on. So here's Joe. Joe comes to us from Harvard University, where he was the data guy. I'm sure there's a more technical word than that, but he was the data guy on Making Caring Common project around this talk, around understanding romantic relationships. He's a lecturer there, and his research revolves around issues of equity and representation, particularly as they relate to gender. Here's his real term. He's not just the data guy. He's the primary quantitative data analyst for the Making Caring Common project. So Joe, greetings, and good to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, hi everybody. It's so nice to be here. I just want to apologize in advance. I am a little under the weather, so fortunately, because this is a webinar, I'm not going to make anybody else sick. But I'm going to try very hard to make sure that my sentences are coherent. I did want to talk to you all just a tiny bit about Making Caring Common before we start this presentation. But before that, we have a quick poll question that we wanted to ask of you. Namely, have you heard of Making Caring Common prior to encountering this research? So I think now, yep, we got the poll here.
So, Joe, most of the people have
Yeah.
never heard of Making Caring Common.
So that's exciting for me, actually, because I'm getting an opportunity to encounter a new audience. So I think it's helpful maybe just to tell you a tiny bit about this, about the project. Making Caring Common is an organization devoted to helping parents, educators, and whole communities to raise children who are caring and responsible and who are committed to justice. So we see a current focus in schools, but also in families, on achievement and personal happiness. And we'd like to direct attention also towards the ethical dimensions that we think families and schools have such an important role in teaching to young people. We combine research, expertise, and the insights of both practitioners, but also parents in developing effective strategies for promoting kindness in children and also helping children to be committed to a greater good. We also try to influence the national conversation through reports like the one that I'm going to talk to you about today, about raising and also educating children to be caring, ethical people. And we also are interested in fostering relationships with parents, communities, and schools in order to help to do this work. Some previous research that we've done, some previous surveys that we've conducted have been on experiences that students have in school and their commitment to caring as a value, the perceptions that children have of gender and specifically of girls and young women in leadership roles, perceptions of racism and economic inequality and how kids think about those issues. And one of our current projects is on college admissions and trying to make the college admissions process a little bit easier for children to navigate and to focus on ethical values as well as things like SAT scores. And we have a website here that you are welcome. I would encourage you to visit if you are interested in learning more about what we do. There's also a newsletter that you can sign up for. So now I'd like to start the actual talk. Can we please go to the next slide? Thanks very much. So this report is called The Talk, and it's about how adults can try to help promote in young people healthy relationships and also to help combat misogyny and sexual harassment. Can we move to the next? Thank you. So I'm going to be leading you through a lot of evidence that we've gathered, but before I do that, I'd like to talk to you about where these conclusions come from. This is definitely what I know best about what we do because this is my primary role on the project. Next slide, please. So the specific results that I'm going to be talking to you about are based on a large nationwide survey of 2,000 young people ages 18 to 25. A lot of the questions that we asked them were about their experiences in high school, but the people who we were actually speaking with are young men and women who are either just finishing high school or possibly just entering the world of work. We also conducted a number of other surveys at specific schools, and we conducted focus groups and interviews in and around Cambridge and Boston. And so although I'm going to be presenting results from this one specific large-scale survey, other talks that we've had, other research that we've done has all provided broadly similar results. So this is not just the result of a single piece of research. It's consistent across multiple different strands. I'm also going to try to identify where what we found resonates with other research that's been done by other people. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to start to take you through the key findings before going to some of the recommendations from Making Caring Common. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the first finding that we have, and again, this is consistent across a lot of research, is that teens and adults tend to greatly overestimate how many young people are hooking up. Hooking up here being having low investment sexual relationships with each other that don't involve an emotional component or maybe even structured specifically to avoid the expression of emotion or friendship. There's a lot of research on how the hookup culture can be harmful to children and to young people, but the evidence that we have is that in the popular mind, this is a lot more common than it actually is. So we actually have a poll question for you now that I'm gonna tell you what students actually told us in a couple of slides, but we'd like to know, if you had to guess, what percentage of young people do you think reported that they would like to hook up on a weekend? Hooking up as opposed to, for example, spending time with friends, spending time alone, spending time with somebody in a serious relationship. Okay, so you all may have a more accurate perception than what we're typically used to encountering. I'm going to give you the answers from our particular survey in a little while, but it looks like the people who are listening here have a pretty good idea of what that might be. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the first piece of evidence from our survey is not directly related to that. We actually posed similar questions to young people on this survey. We asked them, for example, what percentage of 18 and 19-year-olds they thought had more than one sexual partner in a year, which might be indicative of hooking up. What percentage of college students hook up with more than 10 different people over the course of college? And what percentage of 18 to 25-year-olds are casually dating as opposed to being in a serious relationship, not being in a relationship? And for all three items on our survey and across a lot of other groups that we've talked to, people tend to estimate that it's about 54% of young people. So if we take these three items as being indicative of hooking up or the hookup culture, it looks like young people, but also older people, people from a wide variety of different samples, think that this is true of about half of young people. But drawing on other evidence that's been conducted, other research conducted by other people, turns out that the true values are quite a bit lower. In fact, only around 30%, slightly under 30%, maybe a quarter of 18 to 19-year-olds actually report having had more than one sexual partner in a year. Only 20% of college students hook up with more than 10 different people. Only 8% of 18 to 25-year-olds are actually casually dating, whereas far more are in serious relationships, not in a relationship, instead of this casual dating. So without saying anything, without trying to suggest that there's something wrong with having more than one sexual partner in a year, it does seem to be the case that young people and older people systematically misperceive how common this is for young people. Go to the next slide, please. In fact, we asked the students, or the young people in our sample, how many, what they would like to do on an ideal Friday night. We think of the bottom three options there, having sex with a friend, hooking up but not having sex, or having sex with a stranger as being indicative of this hookup culture. And what we found is that only about 15% of young people were interested in any of these three things. We did see somewhat substantial differences between women and young men being far more interested in having sex with a friend or sex with a stranger than their female counterparts were. But in general, both women and young men would have preferred to do things like go out on a date, like have sex in a serious relationship, hang out with friends, or even just spend time alone. We also found consistent results regardless of whether or not the young people we talked to were in a serious relationship at the time. Those who were wanted to go on dates or have sex in a serious relationship. Those who weren't would rather just hang out with their friends or spend time alone. One thing that I had meant to mention earlier, we did also, so I've shown you these statistics broken down by the gender of the respondent. We also compared, for example, across different racial groups, different socioeconomic statuses. We looked for differences by religion, by religiosity, and what we found was pretty consistent results across any group. So although the experiences that young people have are very diverse and the opinions that they hold are very diverse, we didn't see any systematic differences except between young women and young men. And I call those out where I think they're especially relevant. Can we see the next slide, please? So the second piece of evidence that we found is that large numbers of these teenagers and young adults report being unprepared for caring and lasting romantic relationships and would like to hear more about these issues, about how to develop and maintain serious romantic commitments from the adults in their lives, including both parents and teachers, especially teachers of sex education classes, but they're not hearing this from the adults around them. Next slide, please. So we asked these young people which aspects of romantic relationships they wish they had heard more about from either their parents or from their school, and we're showing you these broken down here. And what we saw was that there were a lot of young people who reported wishing that they had heard more from their parents or from their school about how to have and maintain a mature relationship, how to avoid getting hurt in a relationship, and how to handle a breakup. Even some people who wanted to hear more from parents and schools about beginning a relationship. And in general, there were quite few students, quite few young people who didn't want to hear about at least one of those aspects. So only 30% of young people didn't want to hear about any of those things from their parents or didn't wish they had heard more about any of those from their parents, and closer to 35% from their sex ed teachers. So what we saw is a fairly consistent pattern of students telling us that there were aspects of mature relationships, mature romantic and sexual relationships that they wish they had heard more about from the adults in their lives, but that they weren't getting. Next slide, please. In addition, so students are not only feeling that they're not getting enough information from the adults in their lives, we also saw sort of disturbing levels of misogyny and sexual harassment in the reports that young people gave us about their attitudes towards things and about what they had actually done. And we saw evidence that the people in our surveys had a very low bar for ethical behavior during sex and in relationships. In fact, there were several young people who told us that they thought that their sexual conduct was perfectly acceptable as long as they didn't commit rape. So they had set this very low bar for what constituted good behavior in a sexual relationship, whereas I think we would like people to see a sexual relationship as just like any other relationship, requiring respectful treatment of yourself and of your partner. Can we go to the next page, please? So one piece of evidence that we had, which is consistent with other research that has been done on the experience of young people with sexual harassment, we found that quite a few young women in our survey reported having experienced sexual harassment, specifically having been catcalled on the street, having been touched without permission, which would actually be sexual assault, or having a stranger come up to them and say something sexual, also being insulted with sexualized words. Young men were relatively less likely to report having done this, although we still had quite a few young men who would admit to having done one of these things. And ultimately, a full 87% of the young women in our sample had experienced at least one form of sexual harassment, whereas almost half the young men reported having committed some form of sexual harassment. Next page, please. One possible reason for these high rates of experience and actually committing sexual harassment and assault is that young people don't necessarily see these gender-based degradation and subordination as problems in society. They don't see the way that gender plays out in society as a problem. Next page, please. So specifically, we asked young people whether they thought the society had reached a point where there's no more double standard against women. I think specifically no more sexual double standard against women, and a full 48% of the respondents either thought that this was true or at least failed to disagree with this statement. This was more common for young men. They were more likely to agree and to remain neutral, although substantial numbers of young women also said that there's no more double standard against women in the society. A full 39% of the respondents would either agree or remain neutral with the statement that it's rare to see a woman treated in an inappropriately sexualized manner on television. So what we see is that young people do not perceive the way that gender relations play out in society around them as a problem, and they think that we have achieved some sort of gender equality in terms of sexual double standards. At the same time, a full 32%, maybe a third of the male respondents and closer to a fifth of the female respondents thought that it was appropriate that men should be dominant in romantic relationships, so that men should tend to dominate their female partners. We were asking specifically about heterosexual relationships here. And only a handful of respondents thought that women should be dominant. Sort of the most striking finding was at one point we asked students how acceptable it was to commit an act of street harassment, for example, whistling at a woman as she walked by. And we found that there were quite a few male respondents who identified this behavior as acceptable, even though when we asked them later on the survey how they thought the woman would feel, they identified that she would be likely to experience some sort of a negative emotion as a result of this. So they were able to empathize with the young woman, but they still thought it was acceptable. So they're applying what we would say are very different standards for ethical behavior in sexual relationships, or at least when it comes to sex, than we would expect them to apply elsewhere. Next page, please. So despite our findings and findings from a lot of other research, including by the American Association of University Women and lots of other organizations showing that rates of sexual assault and sexual harassment are high among young people, we found that very few students reported actually hearing about these issues from their parents. So can we go to the, parents or educators. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we asked young people to report which conversations they had had with parents, school. We also asked about other adults. One of these was whether they'd heard from parents or school about the importance of being sure that your partner actually wants to have sex with you before you do. Only 40% of young people had heard this from their school, and only 40% from their parents and 50% from their school. Asked, had they heard about the importance of being a caring and respectful sexual partner, which we would think of as sort of the standard that we should be aiming for in any sorts of relationships that we have. And again, the numbers were roughly 40% reported having heard this from their parents and 40% from their school. We could think of an incredibly low bar as not having sex with somebody who's too intoxicated to consent, but still only 40% of young people had heard this from their parents, and only 55% had heard about this from their school, about the importance of not having sex with somebody who is too intoxicated to consent. Think of more subtle forms of misogyny and sexism as being the experience of street harassment. Only 31% of young people had heard from their parents, and roughly the same from their school, about the importance of not engaging in street harassment. When we turn to, we also asked students about maybe more traditional areas in a sex ed curriculum, and we saw that quite a few young people had heard from their schools about more of the nuts and bolts of sex. So for example, how to avoid transmitting or contracting sexually transmitted diseases. It was about half the young people had heard that from their parents and 2/3 from their school. What to do in the case of pregnancy. Again, maybe half the young people had heard about this from their parents and 2/3 from their school. So we'd certainly identify those numbers as being quite a bit lower than what we would hope. But at the same time, it does also look as though young people are hearing from their schools and their parents about how to prevent, about the biology of sex, but not about the ethical and relationship dimensions of sex and about relating with other people based on gender. Next slide, please. So those are the key findings that we drew from the survey that we conducted. And at this point, I want to move on to some recommendations that we have for parents, educators, and just adults in young people's lives for how to have some of the conversations that teenagers not only need to have, but that they report at least wanting to have. Next slide. So again, this section is going to be structured around the question of what can we do as adults, either parents, educators, or other adults who are concerned about the quality of the relationships that young people are having. Next slide. So the first piece of advice that we have is that it's important to talk about love to teenagers and to help them to understand the differences between mature love and other forms of intense attraction, such as lust or crushes. Not trying to denigrate those experiences at all. Those can be positive experiences, but it's important for teenagers and for young people to recognize the difference between a mature, sustained love and a more temporary, more physical experience of something like lust. So I actually like to go to a poll as well, and actually this is feedback that will be very useful for us as an organization. A lot of what we do is based on the assumption that it is important for young people to learn about these topics from adults. And so I'd like to hear what you all think. Is it important for young people to learn about things like mature love from the adults in their lives? Or is this something that young people just have to develop on their own? Oh, okay. All right, great. So this is not an especially controversial assertion. Despite that, I think these are conversations that a lot of adults find very difficult to have. There's a sense, I think, for many parents and many educators that the experience of love is something that young people have to sort of figure out for themselves. But we at Making Caring Common, and apparently you all as an audience, see this as the sort of thing where adult supervision, or not supervision, but adult guidance is really necessary for young people. And again, that's consistent with what young people have told us about what they wish they had heard about from their teachers and their parents. Next slide, please. So the next piece of advice that we have is that it's important to guide young people in identifying and distinguishing between relationships that are healthy and unhealthy. And in particular, it's very important for young people to realize that the fact that they care about somebody and love somebody doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship that they're experiencing is a healthy one. That a healthy relationship requires mutual respect. It requires both partners to be interested in the well-being of the other person, and that you can care very deeply for somebody, but that doesn't necessarily make a relationship a healthy one. So this is an important conversation to have with young people, and it's important, as with all conversations, to begin before the young person encounters an unhealthy relationship. These sorts of advice will be much more effective if young people encounter it before they're actually in the midst of an unhealthy relationship. Next slide, please. It's very important when speaking with young people who are very attentive to hypocrisy and platitudes from the adults with whom they're speaking to go beyond those. Part of that means listening to what young people have to say and really trying to understand their perspectives and to give really concrete advice. And part of this, I think, might explain why so few young people report having heard these conversations with their parents and other adults in their lives. I think it's very easy for adults to think that they have communicated something to young people, but the young people themselves don't actually perceive that conversation as having taken place. So it's crucial when speaking with young people to be as concrete as possible, but also to make sure that we listen to them and try to understand their perspectives. Of course, this becomes more and more important as the person in question becomes older and older. Next slide, please. It's also essential to actually step in and to challenge sexual harassment and misogyny when they occur. Just within the last couple of days, we've been exposed to somebody who's apparently a powerful man in the media world who was allowed to go unchallenged. His sexual harassment was allowed to go unchallenged for decades. And children, of course, are learning from that. So if we allow maybe more minor instances of sexual harassment to go unchallenged, that conveys a message to young people. And the message is that that's not really serious enough to care about. One question that we like to ask of educators is how they would respond if they heard, for example, a table of boys referring to their female classmates as sluts or as bitches. And we've heard a lot of educators express to us that they would be concerned about stepping in. They'd be worried that young people wouldn't take them seriously, or they just think that that conversation would be too awkward to have. But at the same time, if young people are able to use language like that and talk about the young women around them like that without adults stepping in and challenging that, then I think the message that they take away is that this is acceptable behavior and this is an acceptable way to think about the people around them. Next slide, please. I think it's also important, and this is maybe more of the broader mission of making caring common, but it's important for adults to talk with young people about what it means to be an ethical person. And partly that's in the context of sexual and romantic relationships, but also more broadly. The values that we have are some of the most important things that we can transmit to young people. But we often struggle to do that in an explicit way, to actually have those conversations to understand how young people are thinking about ethical issues and to share our perspectives with them. In particular, it's really important to help young people understand that there's more to being an ethical person in the context of a sexual relationship than simply taking no for an answer. I mean, certainly that's a crucial aspect of being a good person in a sexual relationship. But being a good person goes far beyond just not doing terrible things to other people. And these are the sorts of conversations that I think young people would really benefit from, especially if adults are able to connect issues of morality and ethics in sex to issues of morality and ethics outside of sex, and helping kids understand that what they need to do is be caring, respectful people in general. Next slide, please. So I know these conversations can be very difficult to have, especially because young people sometimes give us the impression that they're not interested in what we have to say about these issues. But what we have heard from the young people that we spoke to is that they do actually want this guidance. I think we can certainly see that they need it, that they need to hear adult perspectives on these issues, even if the adults themselves haven't figured everything out. But the young people that we speak to tell us that this is something that they want to have as well. Maybe not in the moment, but the college-age students that we spoke to said that they wish that they had had more of these conversations with their parents and with their school, with their teachers and other educators when they were younger. Next slide, please. Thanks. So I think at this point, I just wanted to share with you a few more resources that we have for parents, but also for educators, and then to open things for questions. So one more slide. Thank you. So we have, I have a link here to the full report. There's an executive summary, which I think is very informative, but if you have the time, it's worth reading the entire report to understand a little bit more of the nuance of what we found and where the data are actually coming from. Also, strongly encourage you to check out our website. This is one of the reports that we've released recently, but we'd like to engage with people around the nation in conversations of other issues around ethics and young people. We also have some resources about how to actually have these conversations with young adults, and we have a social media presence where we'd love to hear from you all. We're also, I think, going to be adding to the website, bringing in some of the resources from the Dibble Institute as well, about evidence-based programs for actually fostering healthy relationships with young people. So I think at this point, I'd like to open this for questions and to say thank you once more to everybody for being here and listening to me as I ramble on and on.
No, Jill, that was great. This is Kay. That was wonderful and I think really informative, especially for people who, you know, it sounds like this is a very smart group. 100% of them said it was important to have discussions with young people about love and those issues around love and sex. But we know all too often it's hard to have those conversations with other key decision makers. So I think you presented a lot of great data. I was going to add that there's a handout connected with this webinar.
Thank you. Yes.
That is the full report. You can pull it down. We will also have Joe's slides posted when we post this webinar in our archives. So you can, you know, take that same data and show it to the people who you want to know. So I have a few questions here. The first one is, are you involved, or is Making Caring Common involved in the It's on Us initiative around preventing sexual assault in schools?
That is a really good question. I'm not involved with that aspect of Making Caring Common. I think we've definitely talked about the initiative, but I'm not sure what our level of involvement is, but that's something where I can get back to you. I'm definitely aware of that initiative, and I think there may be people on Making Caring Common who are at least speaking with those people.
So that's another project at Harvard. Would you say that?
Oh, okay.
I mean,
I'll have to get back to you. I'm afraid that's not an aspect of the research that I have been involved in.
worries. So in an earlier slide where you had all that data around misogyny and were young people, how many of them approved or were neutral on various things. In your last sentence, you said many men considered street harassment acceptable. Do you know what is the proportion? What percentage? How many is many?
So I'm going to have to give you an exact answer. I'm going to have to look it up. I believe it was something on the order of like 30%. That could be an overestimate. But there was, I would say, somewhere between 20 to 30% of young men who, when they were asked about how they thought the victim of street harassment would respond to that, said that she would feel either offended, angry, or frightened, even frightened.
Right.
Had also said that they thought it was acceptable or even completely acceptable for the young man in question to do that. So there's a sense that they are aware of the negative effects, the negative consequences that this could have for somebody who is targeted by street harassment, but at least a sizable handful of the people that we spoke to don't think that that's a problem.
Yeah, more than one is too many.
Absolutely.
Are these resources available in Spanish? So
that is a great question.
The Making Caring Common, the voice or the talk report, is it available in Spanish?
I'm going to have to get back to you about that as well. I don't believe so, but I could have just missed out on that particular conversation. I think a lot of the resources that we point to are external resources, and I wouldn't be able to say what languages those have been translated into. But I don't believe that we have that.
Okay, so you'll get back.
Yeah.
And
that's my answer for everything.
Yeah, there you go. And then if there's specific resources on your resource page, then this person can do their own research to see if they're available in Spanish. I know the Dibble programs have some of the materials translated into Spanish for the young people and for their parents. How do I have these conversations with young people who have already adopted an unhealthy relationship model or show signs of abusive behaviors?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm not sure that there's any single answer, since so much is going to depend on the specific young person and what the behaviors are that they've sort of started to identify with. I would say it's important to start as early as possible, but I know that you've identified this as a young person who's already started to show signs of abusive behavior. I think I'm not sure exactly how that conversation starts, but I think that at least the evidence that we have is that a lot of young people are interested in hearing the perspectives of the adults around them, even if they don't show it immediately. So one piece of advice I would have is that even if initially it doesn't seem like the young person is interested in hearing from you, there's a very good chance that they are internalizing some of what they're hearing and that what you're saying is having an effect, even if the effect is slow to manifest. Again, we're asking young people who have been out of high school for maybe 7 years, and they're telling us that they wish they had heard more about these various issues from their parents and from their schools. It doesn't necessarily mean that at the time they would appreciate hearing those things, but we do have evidence that kids want to hear that, or at least that afterwards they wish they had had those conversations.
Okay, great. I would add that, it looks like, there we go. And I would add that, when you teach, if you look at the Dibble website, there are a lot of free sample materials, free sample lessons And often our materials are taught to young people who don't have the healthiest of relationships or are in abusive relationships. And we find that young people often make different choices. They break up, they get restraining orders, when you show them what's a positive relationship, not just what to avoid, but what to look towards, we have to give young people a lot of credit for making good choices. Is it ethical, though, for a teacher to instill morals and values in the youth they teach? As an important adult in a young person's life, I totally agree, just not that I agree with teachers. So I think this person is saying they agree that having trusted adults or important adults, but maybe not teachers, instill values. So what's your question? What's your answer to that?
Well, I think that my perception as somebody who was a high school teacher is that we are constantly modeling values for young people in the ways that we treat the people around us. Values, for example, of mutual respect for the people around us, the values of honesty, openness. So I think as a teacher, you probably are sending moral messages to young people. I do think that that teachers can take this too far. In particular, if teachers become didactic and refuse to listen to students and end up talking at them, that can be a problem, both because, as you point out, a teacher is a very powerful person in a young person's life, but also because that's a very ineffective way to persuade people. So I think one thing teachers can do is to listen to young people, can help young people to connect the values that they hold in other areas to the areas of romantic and sexual relationships. So helping young people see, for example, that if they value things like courage, like honor, or respect for the people around them, that these are values that they should also be applying to their sexual partners and their romantic partners. So I think it would be a problem for a teacher. I think teachers could present these in problematic ways by being overbearing or domineering, but at the same time, I think teachers are always instructing young people through their actions and through the conversations that they hold. And I think that there are ways to do that that are ethical.
Okay, are there resources for teens themselves to check out for more information on these topics that a teacher could mention to them?
I believe that some of those are listed at the end of the talk. I'm going to have to check to be sure. I think our audience is usually more the adults in young people's lives. But yes, so at the very end of the full report, there's a section of resources for teens and young adults, especially, that I think would be appropriate for those, for the young people themselves.
Okay. How do you deal with the effects of early porn exposure on young people's expectations of sex and relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't think I have I don't have a strong research-based response, and maybe Kay can supplement anything that I have to say. But I think, again, part of that is to help young people to distinguish between, help them to understand that the relationships and even the physical acts that are being presented in pornography are not necessarily reflective of what a healthy sexual relationship actually looks like. And this is a very uncomfortable conversation to have, possibly, because it means discussing with young people what a healthy sexual relationship actually does look like. My go-to, though, even for this specific question, would be that young people are interested in learning from the educators and parents around them. And so if you're able to point out to them that this is just not a realistic way to relate to another person, and it's not even a healthy way to relate to another person, that I think teenagers will listen, even if it's a very slow process. I'd also say some of the resources that we list in the report are specifically about the exposure of young people towards pornography, which represents these unrealistic relationships between generally women and men.
Okay. Have you held workshops for parents to build their confidence in having these conversations with young people? And how do we expect parents to have these conversations when they may themselves be in unhealthy relationships or are unaware of the problematic nature of misogyny?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So for the first question, I have not personally led those conversations, but I do believe that's something that Making Caring Common and our founder, Rick Weisbord, have been involved in actually speaking to parents and helping them to identify ways to have these conversations. One suggestion that he has is that representations of women in popular media can sometimes be a good in. Identifying with kids and hearing what they think about the way women are presented in various media. For the second question, as I'm remembering, it's about how can parents who are themselves maybe in relationships that are unhealthy talk to their children about this. I think it's a very challenging thing to do, but at the same time, I think that even when we are in relationships that are not healthy, that are not positive, we frequently want better for our children and are able to identify those aspects for our children. I think it's a very hard thing to do, though, because I think children realize maybe even better than the parents when the relationships the parents are in are not healthy. So I think it's important to talk to kids, even if you are in an unhealthy relationship, but that part of that may be the young person responding to you and challenging you to bring that same perspective to bear on your own relationships. For the last question about people who don't even see this as problematic, I think there are a lot of people who would not see misogyny as being as much of a problem as I do, but I think that there are also aspects of it that a lot of people would agree with are a problem. So I think that there are a lot of parents who, for example, acknowledge that it's important to be a caring and respectful partner in sex. That, to me, that seems like a very, very low bar to clear. And so even parents who do, for example, believe that it's appropriate for young men to be dominant in romantic and sexual relationships will at least acknowledge the importance of being a respectful and caring sexual partner or romantic partner. So one response to that might be that it's important to identify shared values to start with, maybe before trying to persuade people to take other aspects of misogyny more seriously. I think that a lot of this is a very, just as the Dibble Institute, a lot of this is very nonpartisan. And we have almost consensus among adults about the problematic aspects of some of these relationships.
And I would add that, in the way we've engaged parents in a lot of our curricula is that at the end of every lesson, we send a worksheet home with the student to talk over some question, and nothing personal, nothing, that gets way into the weeds, but things like, what do you think are the most important parts of a healthy, long-lasting romantic relationship? And so the young person's just gone over that in their lesson, that they can talk to their parent or other trusted adult, and that, it's easier to get adults involved if you come in through the door of their children. And we have often had teens say, "Give me an extra workbook because mom's mom needs this." So we know that there is a give and take there between parents and their children. Let's see. Do you have any recommendation on how to gain access to students in schools to help educate them on healthy dating behaviors? We've come up against barriers.
I'm afraid that I am not really involved in that aspect of things. I'm sure there are a lot of barriers. I'm sure there are a lot of schools that are very uncomfortable about having these sorts of conversations. My one suggestion might be, and this is based on what I heard another presenter at a panel say, depending on how you frame the specific issue, schools might be more comfortable with that. So a school that's uncomfortable having somebody come in to talk to students about sexuality, for example, might be more comfortable if you were to come in to talk about respectful relationships among young people, and then discussions of respect and mutual caring within a romantic relationship could be a part of that. But I haven't done that myself, and so I don't have a lot of recommendations. I can ask somebody else at Making Caring Common to see if they have any other suggestions.
Well, and we have a lot of experience of that at the Dibble Institute. And Amber, I saw you ask this question, maybe there's others, and I'd be happy to have one-on-one chats depending on your school codes, what your school laws are for your state. You may find that teaching this in health classes, teaching it in family and consumer science classes, in places where they already have to cover this material, it'd be a way to gain access pretty easily. So happy to go out. My email will be at the end, and happy to talk more about that. What is the data, Joe, about young men being harassed?
That is an excellent question. So we did not ask about this in this particular research. We were very narrowly focused on this, on misogyny in particular. However, I know that the American Association of University Women have done surveys of sexual harassment in schools, and they have asked young men about this. Well, young men here being boys, so I think up through high school, and they report surprisingly, or what was to me surprisingly high rates of sexual harassment. Not as high as young women, but quite a few young men report sexual harassment in their day-to-day lives at schools. I don't have the exact numbers, but I know that their most recent report has something about that.
Okay. Kind of moving you along because I'm feeling like we have a lot to go through. Do you feel the statistics for how this, let's see, I'll just read this directly. Do you feel the statistics for how this all affects the LGBTQIA community is still not quite where it should be?
I do. I think that there's that is a community that has a lot of unique experiences around sexual harassment and violence within romantic relationships, and I think it is an understudied group. So I believe the question was whether I think that the statistics are not really where they need to be, and I think that is the case.
Okay. Did your research focus on youth wanting advice from parents and schools, or more on resources and guidance? So did you ask them more about parents and schools, or did you just say, did you want more resources and guidance?
So I may be misunderstanding the question, but we were asking students about specific kinds of guidance that they might have wanted to get from either their parents or from their schools. So it was not so much about specific resources that they had access to, but more about what sort of guidance they wished they had gotten from either parents or from their schools, but that they felt that they hadn't.
Okay. What was your research just a question about who has experienced or perpetrated sexual assault or harassment divided by gender, as you presented it in this presentation?
Yeah, for this particular survey, we asked, if I'm understanding the question correctly, we were asking young women about their experiences of sexual harassment and young men about whether they had committed acts of sexual harassment. Okay. That was the only question where different versions were presented according to the respondent gender.
And you also earlier said that's where you found the main differences, that you had looked at ethnic and racial and other variables, but the one that made the most difference was the male-female.
Yeah, the only real differences, there was some very, very slight differences on certain questions based on political affiliation, like how liberal or conservative the respondent rated themselves. But the vast majority of differences that we saw when we asked the same question of both students were based on gender. Okay. Not so much for the questions that I presented, but the items about misogyny, and about what they wanted, what their ideal Friday night would look like. We got very different responses from young women than from young men.
I see. Okay, and I think we're gonna let me get Kathy back on here. Kathy, if we go over, where did that go?
Unmuted.
I think Kathy's telling us it's almost time to be done. Kathy, can we keep going on these questions? I have like 10 more.
It's 5 o'clock, so we are seeing a decline of participants as well. So
yeah, let me, I would like to, yeah, let me just go through a few more of these questions. So for those of you who can stay on, please stay on, because I'd like to get these answered for people who are listening later. How would you advise someone to implement the information with young adults with developmental or mental disabilities?
That is a great question. I do not have any specific advice. We haven't looked into that specific issue, and I'm sure that those populations, like different approaches, will be appropriate for different students. I think young people with intellectual or developmental disabilities are probably also really eager to hear from their parents, but the specific strategies that would be helpful are not something that I can speak to, although that's a very interesting question.
Let me add that we have a program at the Dibble Institute called Mike's Crush, which is specifically developed for young people on the autism spectrum and for those with learning disabilities. It's a video-based learning program developed by a sex education teacher out of Pennsylvania who realized they needed to know more about the social and emotional sides of sex than the physical sides of sex, and so that's a great resource. Are there any other kindness or empathy building curricula you would recommend for educators, Joe?
We're actually, I will have better answers for that soon. We're implementing a large scale research project to look at which different strategies are effective at promoting kindness and empathy. At the moment, I don't have any specific recommendations, but I can ask the team to see if anybody has one.
You might look at CASEL, the Council for the Advancement of Social and Emotional Learning out of Chicago. They have a big database. In my experience, there is tremendous sexual pressure from girls to boys, especially in middle school. Any comment on that, Joe?
That was not a focus of our research. I'm sure you're quite right about that, though. And I do think that the sorts of conversations that we've been recommending about the importance of treating people with respect and respecting their decisions, we often think of those as conversations that are especially important for young men to have. And I think that may be true, but I think young women could also benefit from a discussion around being respectful of the other person and not pressuring somebody into having sex. So those specific suggestions, I think, are appropriate for young women as well as for young men.
Okay, so I know you need to hang off here and get to a class. Yeah, so let's, for those of you, we have maybe a dozen more questions left. We will get back to you with those answers, and we're so thrilled because this was obviously a topic of great interest. Thanks for joining us today.
We'll
put this webinar and the slides up online. Joe, if you need to go, we'll say goodbye now because I have a few, just wrap up things.
All righty.
So
thank you all very much.
Joe. We'll put the webinar up on our website. We'll also have the slides with it. If you have questions, you can contact me or Kathy. And as I say, we'll get back to you on the other things. Keep in touch, all the usual ways. Here we are. We're gonna, so subscribe to our newsletter. And next month, which for those of you who are interested in more about this field, we have a guy who spent years and years looking at the field of relationship education, and he's come to the conclusion that you've got to start with the kids. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Alan Hawkins with us next month. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. We will respond to your questions, and we'll see you in November. Take good care. Bye-bye.